the box wasn't heavy. That was the part that made it hardest. Brynn Sauer carried it with both arms anyway, out of her friend Carla's spare bedroom, down the narrow hallway that smelled like cat litter and old coffee, and into the gray October morning, where the community center parking lot was already filling up with folding tables and early birds who circled garage sales like they sensed something worth saving. She found a spot near the back, away from the entrance, near the chain-link fence where the late morning sun would eventually reach. She unfolded her table. She set the box down. Then she just stood there for a moment, looking at what was inside it. A nursing commendation plaque from Mercy General, engraved with her name and the year 2019. A certificate from the Army Nurse Corps. A unit patch, the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagle, worn and faded at the corners from 3 years of handling, from the habit she had of running her thumb across it when she needed to remember who she was. A small medal in a plastic case, the Army Commendation Medal with a V device for valor, awarded after a night in Kandahar when the incoming fire didn't stop, and she didn't stop either. She'd been a combat nurse before she was an ER nurse. She'd been a soldier before she was a civilian. She had kept these things because they were the only proof she had, on bad days, that she had once been someone worth being. She was selling them for $40. Not because they were worth $40. Because she had $11 left in her checking account, and 2 days before Carla, who loved her, who had told her repeatedly that she wasn't a burden, would quietly lose patience with a houseguest who had no real plan. Because the storage unit on the east side of Minneapolis, where she kept the rest of her furniture and her winter coats and the 3 bankers' boxes of documentation she had spent 2 months assembling, cost $54 a month. Because she had not worked in 43 days. She arranged the items on the table like she was setting a place for dinner. She put a small price tag on the plaque. She told herself she wouldn't cry. She lasted 9 minutes. It had started the way most catastrophes start, not with a crash, but with a form. Brynn had been working the overnight shift in the Vive Hospital's intensive care unit the night she noticed the discrepancy. She was 30 years old, 2 years out of her second deployment, and she had been at Harmon Voss Medical Center in Minneapolis for 14 months. Long enough to know which doctors were brilliant, which were lazy, and which were something else entirely. Dr. Stuart Vick was something else entirely. He was the kind of man who smiled at nursing staff during board walkthroughs and didn't bother learning their names any other time. He was the kind of administrator-physician hybrid who cared more about metrics than patients, who talked about throughput and resource allocation in meetings where the topic was supposed to be veteran care. He had a corner office with a view of the river and a reputation carefully maintained for running a tight ship. The form Brynn found was a medication administration record for a veteran named Douglas Fry, 61 years old, admitted for complications from diabetes-related kidney failure. The record showed he had received his scheduled opioid pain management at 11 p.m. Brynn had been the nurse on that floor at 11 p.m. She had not administered it. She had checked his chart and found no standing order for that medication on that night. She had noted the discrepancy, double-checked, and found a second record, a backup log that didn't match the primary. Someone had logged a medication that was never given. She knew what that meant. She'd seen drug diversion in a hospital once before during her residency, and it had the same fingerprints. Records that existed only on paper, quantities that didn't reconcile, a pattern of small thefts that added up over months into something that killed people, either through the drugs diverted to someone who shouldn't have had them, or through the pain management that the patient never received. Douglas Fry had died 6 days later. His death was attributed to complications from his underlying conditions. Brynn had gone to the nursing supervisor. The nursing supervisor had gone to the department head. The department head had gone to the hospital board, and 3 weeks later, Brynn had been called into a meeting with HR, a hospital attorney, and Dr. Vick himself, who sat across from her with the careful stillness of a man who had done this before, and told that her contract was being terminated due to documented performance concerns and a pattern of disruptive behavior in the workplace. She had never received a single written warning. She had a file full of commendations. She asked to see the documentation. She was told it was under review. She asked about the medication records she had flagged. She was told that an internal review had found no irregularities. She was told very quietly by the hospital attorney that the terms of her severance agreement included a non-disparagement clause. She didn't sign the severance agreement. They fired her anyway. The garage sale started at 8. By 9:30, she had sold her grandmother's old bread maker for $6 and a set of curtain rods for $3. A man in a Viking sweatshirt had looked at her nursing plaque, asked if she was a nurse, and when she said yes, he'd said, "My wife's a nurse too," and moved on. The Commendation Medal stayed in its case. The unit patch stayed next to it. She was pouring herself the last of the coffee from her thermos when she heard the dog. Not barking. It wasn't that. It was the sound of paws on pavement, the particular rhythm of a working dog moving with purpose, and she looked up in time to see a German shepherd cross the parking lot with the focused attention of an animal that had somewhere to be. He was big, dark-saddled, wearing a tactical vest in olive drab. His handler was a step behind, tall, maybe mid-30s, with the particular way of walking that she recognized from people who had spent years carrying weight and never quite stopped. The dog's name, she would later learn, was Axel. Axel was not supposed to be interested in garage sales. He was a service dog, a military working dog, medically retired from active duty, now partnered with his handler in a program that helped veterans transition into civilian life. He was trained and steady and professional in the way that working dogs always are, which is to say completely, with every cell of his body. He crossed the parking lot, passed 3 tables without slowing, walked directly to Brynn's table, and sat down. He put his nose an inch from the unit patch and stayed there. The handler, his name was Cord Tillman, though she didn't know that yet, said, "Axel, heel." Axel did not heel. He lowered his head and rested his chin on the table, directly on top of the 101st Airborne patch, and looked up at Brynn with brown eyes that had no apology in them. Cord came to stand beside his dog and looked at the table. He looked at the patch. He looked at the metal in the plastic case. Then he looked at Brynn. "That's a Screaming Eagle patch," he said. "Yes," she said. "You serve with them?" "Out of Fort Campbell. 2 deployments, 2015 to 2018. Something shifted in his face. "Not much, just enough. I was 75th Ranger Regiment," he said. "We overlapped in Kandahar, 2016. She looked at him. She looked at the dog, who still had not moved. "He does this sometimes," Cord said, with a gesture toward Axel that was halfway between an apology and an explanation. "Military gear, the smell of it, Kevlar, gun oil, whatever, gets into the fabric over there and never really washes out. He was trained to alert to certain things, and some of it just stays in him." He paused. "What's the V device for?" She hadn't wanted to explain it. She had put a $40 price tag on the whole collection specifically so that she wouldn't have to explain any of it, so that someone would just pay the money and take it, and she wouldn't have to watch it go. "There was a night," she said, "when the fob took fire and we lost the generators. I was the senior medical personnel on site. We performed 3 surgeries by flashlight." She stopped. "2 of those soldiers are still alive." Cord was quiet for a moment. "Why are you selling it?" he asked. She had prepared an answer for this. She had been preparing it since the night before, standing in Carla's bathroom at 2 a.m. rehearsing casual responses to strangers. She had a whole story about downsizing, about starting fresh, about not needing the physical objects to hold the memories. She looked at the $40 price tag. She looked at Axel, who had not moved his chin from the patch. "I need the money," she said. "I lost my job." "What do you do?" "I'm a nurse. I was a nurse at Harmon Voss Medical Center." She stopped again. "I reported something I saw, and then I wasn't a nurse anymore." Cord bought her coffee. Not from a thermos, from the diner 3 blocks away, where they sat in a corner booth with Axel beneath the table, and she told him the whole story for the first time without a lawyer present. She told him about Douglas Fry. She told him about the medication records. She told him about the 2 other deaths she had identified in the months before her termination. Veterans with documented pain complaints whose medication logs showed administration that the nursing staff, when she had quietly asked, couldn't remember giving. She told him about the 3 bankers' boxes in her storage unit. Printed records, screenshots of the discrepancies before the system was updated, her own contemporaneous notes, the names of 2 other nurses who had noticed irregularities and said nothing because they were afraid. She told him she had tried to report it to the VA Office of Inspector General and had been told the complaint was under review. She had tried to contact the state medical board. She had gone to an employment attorney who had told her that without the severance agreement signed, she was in a complicated position. "How long have you been out of work?" Cord asked. 43 days. "Where are you staying?" She told him about Carla's couch. She told him about the $11 in her account and the storage unit payment due in 6 days. She did not cry while she told him any of this, which surprised her because she had been crying in Carla's bathroom at intervals for 6 weeks. Cord listened the way soldiers listen, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just taking it in. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The OIG complaint," he said. "Who did you file with, the central hotline or the regional office?" Central hotline. That's the problem. Central hotline goes into a queue. If no one flags it for priority review, it can sit for months. He put his phone on the table. "There's a regional veterans advocate in St. Paul, Colonel Ruth Harmon, retired Army JAG. She runs an advocacy office out of the American Legion chapter there. She has direct lines into the OIG's medical fraud division. I know her. I can call her today." Brynn looked at him. "Why would you do that?" He looked at Axel, who had settled into a sphinx position under the table and was watching her with those unhurried brown eyes. "Because Axel sat down," Cord said. Simply, like that explained everything, and somehow sitting in that diner booth on a gray October morning with the smell of coffee and whatever it was that still lived in military fabric, it did. The next 10 days moved fast, and then slow, and then fast again, in the way that things move when institutions start to pay attention. Cord called Colonel Harmon that afternoon. Colonel Harmon, 62 years old, with a voice like gravel and a network built over 30 years of JAG work, made 2 calls before 5 p.m. and had a federal case number assigned to Brynn's complaint by the following morning. That was when things started to get complicated. Dr. Vick had friends. Brynn had known this in the abstract. You didn't run a VA hospital department for 11 years without accumulating allies, but she hadn't fully understood it until a woman she didn't recognize appeared at Carla's door on day 3 and told Brynn, pleasantly, that her former employer was prepared to discuss the terms of a mutual resolution, and that it would be in her interest to contact the hospital's legal team before the OIG process went further. Brynn did not open the door wider than the chain allowed. She called Cord. He drove over. He sat in Carla's tiny kitchen, and they went through her 3 bankers' boxes together, page by page, organizing everything into the specific categories that Colonel Harmon needed. The medication logs, the death records, the timestamps on the system updates that had altered the primary documentation. There were moments when Cord's jaw went tight looking at the files. These were veterans, men who had survived combat and come home to die in a hospital that was supposed to care for them. And Brynn had to look away. On day 6, she paid the storage unit bill. The $54 came from a Venmo transfer Cord sent her before she'd even mentioned it, with a message that said only, "Keep the evidence secure." On day 7, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was a man who identified himself as a former Harmon Voss pharmacist. He said he had records that matched hers. He was afraid. She talked to him for 90 minutes and gave him Colonel Harmon's number. He called Harmon within the hour. That was the piece they'd been missing. Someone with inside access to the pharmacy dispensing records. Someone who could show not just that medications were logged as given and not given, but that they were being physically removed from the dispensary before they ever reached the floor. The pharmacist's name was Kevin Ostrander. He had been keeping his own records for 8 months, waiting for someone who looked like they weren't going to be bought off. The OIG investigation was formally opened on day 11. On day 14, federal investigators arrived at Harmon Voss with a warrant. Cord called Brynn at 6 in the morning to tell her, because he had a contact watching the hospital parking lot, and his voice when he told her was steady and warm, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. She sat on the edge of Carla's bed in the dark for a long time after she hung up. The investigation took 6 weeks. Brynn did not get those weeks back. She still ate ramen, still slept in the spare room, still woke at 3 a.m. with the particular anxiety of someone whose professional life had been surgically removed. But the texture of those weeks was different. She was a witness now, not a problem. She had a federal case number. She had Colonel Harmon returning her calls same day. She had Cord, who showed up twice a week with Axel and groceries he said he was going to eat anyway, and who sat at Carla's kitchen table and helped her draft her witness statement with the same methodical patience he'd brought to everything else. What the investigation found was worse than what Brynn had documented. Dr. Stuart Vick had been diverting opioid medications from veteran patients for 4 years. The amounts had escalated from small, single doses, occasional, to systematic. He had falsified records across 3 different charting systems, exploiting update protocols that allowed administrators to edit primary logs under certain conditions. He had identified with the specific cruelty of a man who understood institutional blind spots, which veterans were least likely to have family members checking on their care: isolated men. Men with no next of kin on file. Men who were already in pain and who, when their pain management wasn't working, were documented as agitated or confused or demonstrating drug-seeking behavior. 2 of those men had died. Douglas Fry was one of them. When Brynn read the full investigative summary, Colonel Harmon sent it to her the night before it became public record. She sat at Carla's kitchen table and put her face in her hands, not because she was surprised. She had known, in the part of her that had been a combat nurse and knew what it looked like when someone was dying and the documentation didn't match. She had known for 43 days that she was right. But knowing and reading are different things. Reading it made it the size it actually was. Carla brought her tea and sat beside her without saying anything, which was exactly right. Dr. Vick was arrested on a Tuesday. The charges were federal: healthcare fraud, opioid diversion, falsification of medical records, and an account that Brynn had not anticipated, 2 counts of criminally negligent conduct in connection with patient deaths. He was taken from his office at Harmon Voss in front of the nursing staff, who had spent 4 years working around his careful wrongness and not saying anything, because saying anything cost too much. The hospital board, 3 of whose members had signed Brynn's termination paperwork, were notified that they were subjects of a parallel administrative inquiry. Brynn's attorney, she had one now, a veteran advocate working pro bono through Colonel Harmon's office, filed a wrongful termination suit within 24 hours of Vick's arrest. The hospital's legal team, facing federal investigators in their building, and a civil suit with airtight documentation, did not respond with the aggressive posture they'd used 43 days earlier. They responded with a settlement offer. Brynn negotiated. She had learned something in those 6 weeks about what it felt like to have nothing left to lose and what that freedom was worth. She negotiated her full reinstatement, back pay for the 43 days plus the 6 weeks of investigation, a written retraction of the performance concerns documentation, and, the part that her attorney said was unusual to get, a formal public statement from the hospital board acknowledging that her termination had been improper. She also negotiated a separate meeting with the families of Douglas Fry and the other veteran who had died. This part wasn't in the settlement terms. She asked for it herself. She sat across from those families in a conference room and told them what she had seen, what she had done, and what it had cost her, not so they would feel sorry for her, but so they would know that someone had noticed their father, their husband, their brother, and had not looked away. Douglas Fry's daughter, a woman about Brynn's age with her father's jawline and his steady eyes, reached across the table and took Brynn's hand without saying anything. Brynn had not been able to look away from her. She went back to the garage sale location in November, even though there was no garage sale anymore. She didn't know quite why. She stood in the empty parking lot of the community center and looked at the strip of pavement where her folding table had been, at the chain-link fence and the cold Minnesota sky above it. She had her ID badge again. She was back on a floor, a different VA facility, a position that paid more, with a unit that had been quietly looking for a charge nurse with her specific background. The three bankers' boxes were in her own storage unit now, organized and cataloged, because the federal case was ongoing, and she was the primary civilian witness, and she had learned to be meticulous about the things that mattered. She heard paws on pavement. Axel walked across the parking lot to her with the same purposeful certainty he'd had in October, and sat beside her without being asked. Cord followed, hands in the pockets of his jacket, watching his dog with the half-smile of a man who had long since stopped pretending to be surprised by what Axel knew. "He wanted to come back," Cord said. "I figured I'd let him." Brynn looked down at the dog, who looked back at her with those quiet brown eyes. "I left something for you," she said. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the unit patch, the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagle, worn at the corners, with the particular smell of old fabric and somewhere far away that a dog had identified across a parking lot on a gray morning 6 weeks ago. She held it out. Cord shook his head. "That's yours." "It was almost gone," she said. "I want you to have it, for him." She looked at Axel. "So he knows what he did." Cord was quiet for a moment. He took the patch with both hands, the way you're supposed to receive something that matters, and looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into his own jacket pocket and took out a 75th Ranger tab, faded, worn, with the same texture of miles on it that hers had, and held it out to her. "Fair trade," he said. She took it. She stood in the empty parking lot with a Ranger tab in her hand, and a German shepherd leaning his full weight against her leg, and the cold Minneapolis wind coming off the river, and for the first time in a long time she felt the exact size of herself. Not small, not cut down, not the version of her that had stood at a folding table with a $40 price tag on the only proof she had of who she was. The full size, the real one. The one that had held a flashlight steady in the dark while the fob burned and done what needed to be done. Axel pressed his head against her hip, and she put her hand on his back, and the three of them stood there in the parking lot together, not saying anything, while the November sky went the particular gray that meant snow before nightfall, and the city around them moved on without pausing, the way cities always do. She had a badge in her pocket. She had a case number with her name on it. She had two families who now knew that someone had seen their father and refused to look away. She had what she'd needed all along, not proof that she had once been worth something, but certainty, bone-deep and unborrowable, that she still was.